Hurricane development possible. Hi, everybody. I'm Chief Meteorologist Chris Justice. The models have been consistent here toward the middle of the month, trying to develop not only a tropical system, but possibly even a hurricane. We've got to keep an eye on this, and if history teaches us anything, this is not only possible, but likely each hurricane season to get a little something to crop up. And here it is over the Caribbean, moving toward the north and east, not only forming, but possibly impacting some of the islands here with some damaging winds and the possibility of some flooding rain. This is a pattern that we have to keep an eye on, and just like the wintertime when we're talking about snow, I can tell you with hurricanes if the pattern is favorable or not favorable, and in this case we've got to keep a close eye on it because as we look closer at this pattern, it certainly is showing me some signals that we could try to get something to form here. Let's look closer at what's going on with the pattern. There is not much cooking right now. There's just some regular old thunderstorms, but that's where it all starts, and you got to think the water here across the Gulf and the Caribbean is such that we've got some warming of the waters, especially with all this sunshine kicking up today and in the days to come. When we look at the ocean heat content, it shows you basically the fuel possible for storms to form. And in this case, that area of the Caribbean is a hot spot that we need to keep a close eye on in the coming days. And sure enough, that's where some of our models are hinting. So let's start broad, and then I'll zoom into more particulars on what could happen and where. Let's start with the GFS model. It shows pretty calm conditions through the next week. That said, as we get deeper into the month here, I'm talking the 13th, 14th, we've got some disturbances that try to form down here in the Caribbean. And once that happens, we'll start to get the potential of some deeper low pressures. And here we go deeper into the month as we get toward the 15th, 16th. Models have been pretty consistent on the time and the locations. That area I showed you, remember that area right here, warm waters. I mean, you're talking about cooking here. Temperatures that are well above 80 degrees for fuel for these storms to form. And here we go with a weak low pressure. That's where it starts, and this would be Saturday, May 17th. As we look closer at this, it looks like this low pressure deepens and tries to move off toward the north, possibly getting close to Jamaica. Definitely getting close to Haiti and the Dominican Republic, maybe even the eastern tip of Cuba here. Some of the Bahamas would have to watch this with potential big rains. That said, it's not just one low pressure. Some of the models here are trying to depict. You're looking at the ensembles, multiple different variations. Where other low pressure could be. 992 and 990, that would be a strong tropical storm, verging on the possibility of maybe even a hurricane here, especially if it gets sub 990. And this model shows it getting very close to that over Cuba, then getting toward the Bahamas. Got a 987 low. Now, this version of the ensembles, a couple of the runs want to take it close to the southern tip of Florida here. Some of the Bahamas would get a tropical storm or hurricane impacts. Now, this is far out. This is something we have to watch, but I'm telling you, it's a pattern that has given me a signal that, hey, we need to watch it. So that was the ensemble runs in the models. What does today's operational run show? Well, the very latest one shows we're crystal clear. No problems through Mother's Day weekend into next week. No problems whatsoever. We do, however, have a low pressure over the Gulf, which we need to watch as it sits over parts of Alabama, parts of Florida here. It's not likely to form into anything tropical, but if this were June or July, it'd be something we would need to watch closely as it could crank out something tropical. This case, just some good fashion heavy rain. In fact, flooding rain will be possible across Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas going into early next week. That said, the rest of the tropics looking pretty quiet. In fact, we're dry with high pressure settling in for almost everybody. Great week to be on a cruise, great week to be on vacation. I don't see any problems cooking as we go in those neck of the woods. But deeper into the month, 15th and beyond, 15th, 16th, 17th. That's our highlighted time frame here for the possibility of some lower pressure. And right there, you can see it starting to sniff out on the models is where it possibly could form. And today's operational run also, like the ensembles, shows a 990, 994. This case is a 987. This would be a hurricane east of Jamaica toward the 16th, 17th, 18th time frame. This would take it not closer to the United States, but rather toward the Dominican Republic, Haiti. Now, depending on which side of the mountains of Hispaniola wants to go over, that could provide for direction. Does Puerto Rico get some impacts with this? Does it go over parts of the Bahamas? We'd have to watch that. Either way, you slice it. This looks like some big impacts for parts of the Caribbean islands that we need to keep a close eye on in the coming days. Now, this would move on out to the north and not much forms after that. But like history tells us, like I said, hurricane season starts June 1st on the calendar. However, many of the past 10 seasons have had an early start. In fact, 9 out of the past 10 have not. Last year was an anomaly. Started into the third week of June. Now, statistically speaking, June 21st is when we typically get our first named system, but that has not been true the last 10 years. Let's show you closer in so you can look. This most recent run of the GFS model shows Jamaica. I mean, this would be a hurricane here going into the middle of the month. Haiti, the Dominican Republic, goes right over those high mountains, and you know what that does? That provides for a lot of flooding rains for these islands. We would need to watch this very, very closely for wherever it goes. And again, the time frame is that 15th to 19th time frame. If you got travels that way, please share this with your family. And folks, if you're watching right now, let me know in the comment section where you're watching from. I love to see where in the world you're watching from right now, because I know so many of you share this with family and friends outside of the States. Now, this will move on off toward the north and east, and we'd have no problems thereafter. Let's look at what this would mean for wind gusts. I mean, if this thing does turn into a hurricane, it would have the potential to produce winds in excess of 75 to 100 miles per hour. And in that case, yes, it would be a hurricane. Look at that swath going toward Haiti, the Dominican Republic. If you look at your key down here, this could briefly become a strong hurricane. 80 to 90, maybe even 100 mile per hour winds here over the warm waters of the Caribbean. Now, that said, this is not the middle of hurricane season, so it doesn't have the capacity or the capability that it would typically have. However, this would mean some pretty strong winds heading toward the Dominican Republic and Haiti, along with the possibility of some flooding rains. Let's look at that over the course of the next week. Of course, there's some storms here and there. And look at that big rainmaker across the Gulf. I mean, this could mean some flooding rains for Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas. But look, if this thing does turn into a tropical storm or hurricane, you can clearly track the trace of it. I mean, this would mean some rough weathers. Cruises would have to divert. This could go toward Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You're talking between 12 and 15 inches of rain, and for those high mountains, that would not be good. That said, even if you don't get a direct impact from a tropical system, look what happens to Puerto Rico. I mean, you get some of that influence from the outskirts of the rain that come through with it. You're talking 10 plus inches of rain over the next 2 weeks, if that were to come to fruition. Now, that's the GFS America model. What does the European model show? That's our old trusty, as you know. Let's back it up to the last run that kind of gets us out. You can see as we go through the next week, no problem, similar to the GFS, but as we get toward the middle of the month, you start to see some lowering of the pressure here. There's a 999, a little bit further west, western Cuba. Now, at this point, just about anywhere in that area. That's why on this map that I have behind me here, you can see I've got the whole Caribbean highlighted for a risk. Now, this wants to take it close to the Florida Keys. Southern tip of Florida is a weak tropical storm, maybe even a high end would be maybe a weak hurricane. But somewhere in that vicinity, a big rainmaker for the Florida Keys, southern tip of Florida, then the Bahamas. That's a 987 low at some points. That would probably be a Cat 1 hurricane at some point. Tight, compact system is what that European model shows. Now, that's one of many, but just shows you that we're getting some consistency in the models and showing us that, hey, there is a threat there. There is the possibility, there is the signal there of a possible hurricane developing. And in this case, we'd have to watch for that time frame later in the month and to see if that happens. Now, if you average all the different European model runs together, there's 51 of them. As you zoom all the way out, no problems until you get to the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th. That's just the origin. Where could a tropical depression, a tropical named system form in the Atlantic Basin? In this case, it's got that same area highlighted here, which is showing us that consistency that we need to watch. Now, I did want to touch on this. If you're still watching here, you're interested in hurricane season. Now, Colorado State University is the premier kind of forecasters when it comes to tropical weather. And in this case, they break down the 2025 forecast versus what is normal. So if you look specifically, they're going with an above average chance of impacts just about in any state, from Connecticut to Delaware to Florida. But I want to specifically look at Florida here. The forecast probability of a named storm impacting Florida sometime this season is a 92% chance. The forecast probability of a hurricane hitting Florida, there's a 65% chance of a hurricane hitting Florida this year. Now, let's compare that to an average year. An average year would bring 56% chance. So you're talking about a 9 to 10% chance higher than normal. So I like to compare it to normal, because normal is kind of the baseline, right? They get into some really heavy statistics here. But if the normal here, kind of off the screen here, but 29% chance is there's almost a 30% chance of a major hurricane hitting Florida on any given year. That's a pretty high chance. I mean, Florida just kind of sticks out there. It's a risk. You know that. This year, there's a 35% chance of that. Major hurricane impact in Florida. So about a 5 to 6% higher chance than normal over the entire hurricane season. That breaks down to Florida. It even breaks it down to specific counties. Okay, so you can kind of look at this. I'll put this in the comment section so you can kind of look over your county if you'd like. But there's some really great information here from Miami-Dade to Monroe to Nassau, all these different counties, Palm Beach, Sarasota. You look at Sarasota, probably even named hurricane, 43%. Name storm, typical chance is 36% chance. Okay, so of course some counties have higher risks. Louisiana in here, same story. But you can scroll through here, find your state. Let's go to South Carolina, North Carolina. North Carolina has a 76% chance of a named system hitting them on any given year. On this year, typically it's 68% chance. Now you can break that down by county. And going forth to coastal counties of South Carolina. Charleston has a 51% chance this year. Typically, it's a 43%. Horry County, Myrtle Beach, the Grand Strand has a 46% chance. Typically, they have a 39% chance. So just something that we'll need to watch, especially when you combine it with how warm this area of the Caribbean is. When you get something in this area of the Caribbean, of course, it wants to kind of curve up. Does it curve up close to the state of Florida? Does it curve up over Cuba or over Haiti and the Dominican Republic? That is going to be the question that we'll have to answer, because if something does form, if it is a hurricane toward the middle of this month, where does it go? Folks, this is the right place to see where it's going to go. My commitment to you is to always keep you posted. So please, if you haven't already, like this video, subscribe. Let me know in the comment section where you're watching from, and I will keep you posted as anything develops and as anything changes with this development as we move forward.